It is now my pleasure to call on Lloyd Robertson, who will deliver the commencement address.
Father Levesque, members of the faculty, ladies and gentlemen, graduates all, thank you very much for welcoming me here today. And I told Father Levesque a few moments ago that he has his staff and his students very well trained, because when Nancy and I drove in here this morning, we were greeted by a handsome young man at the door and at the driveway just outside, and he said, "Are you coming for Mass?" And I almost had to say yes, because that was the expectation in his eyes. I could see it. But I stammered. I said, "No, I'm coming for the commencement." So he said, "Okay, well, then you can go ahead anyway." And I'll tell you that getting out of Niagara Falls, New York is not easy these days, as you may know. In fact, I had to be guided by Nick Wallenda this morning because there was so much construction coming out toward Lewiston Road. And I'm especially delighted to drive across the bridge and be part of something very special, as opposed to being a cross-border shopper. I have happily accepted your invitation and this distinctive honor because I am humbled to be among the chosen Canadians singled out for this designation, and appreciate that your school is in a unique position to understand the enormous value to both sides in the Canadian-American relationship. As a broadcast journalist over these last 50 years, I've had many opportunities to assess this relationship, and it's fun to come here for another reason, of course. In deciding to write my text in American English, I don't have to fight that squiggly little line that comes up whenever I hit H-O-N-O-R, and it reminds me that in Canadian spelling, it should be H-O-N-O-U-R, of course. And I'm also warned that there is no U in honor. Same thing with savor, flavor, favor, and neighbor. Then there is the ER issue, as in center. R-E in Canada, E-R in the US. Caliber. Canadian is C-A-L-I-B-R-E. American is C-A-L-I-B-E-R. And this, to me, is a peculiar one. Check. The one that's in the mail, you know, from the tax department right now, we hope. It's spelled C-H-E-C-K in the US, like body check, but in Canada, we retain Q-U-E, C-H-Q-U-E. And here's another example of how the more direct approach to spelling, encouraged by early American teachers and scribes, stumbles only occasionally. In Canada, mustache is simply spelled M-U-S-T-A-C-H-E. In the US, it's still acceptable to spell it M-O-U-S-T-A-C-H-E, as in mustachio. And for me, through the years, there have been several special challenges as a Canadian broadcaster, not just with spellings, but pronunciations too. For example, I still say, I have to confess, and I like it, schedule. And in Canada, we still say pleaded. He pleaded his case. In the US, of course, he pled his case. Drives me crazy to hear pled, but we're getting it in Canada now too. These linguistic entanglements are only a few in the broad catalog of many amusing stories that populate the universe of Canadian-American relations. There is this transcript of an actual conversation with a US Navy ship and Canadian authorities off Newfoundland in October of 1995. Picture this. Americans, please divert your course 15 degrees north to avoid a collision. Canadians, recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid collision. Americans, this is the captain of a US Navy ship. I say again, divert your course. Canadians, no, I say again, divert your course. Americans, this is the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln, the second largest ship in the US Atlantic Fleet, We are accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vessels. I demand that you change your course 15 degrees north, that's 5 degrees to the north, or countermeasures will be taken to ensure the safety of this ship. Canadians, pause, eh? This is a lighthouse. It's your call. The letter from your university inviting me to receive an honorary doctoral degree and give the commencement address noted, over our history of more than 150 years, we have tried to instill in our students an appreciation for the intellectual, spiritual, and practical sides of life. Many of the students who will receive graduate degrees will begin their careers as teachers in the elementary and secondary schools of New York State and the nearby province of Ontario. Others are already practicing teachers on both sides of the border. Still others will receive graduate degrees in business administration and criminal justice. Many of our students work as volunteers in service to the poor and homeless in our region and in several metropolitan areas. It's clear that this is an institution that takes seriously the inspiration provided by its founding figure, St. Vincent de Paul, patron of the poor and the disadvantaged. And as Canadians, when we look across the Niagara River Gorge and see your university and understand what it represents, it gives us hope for America as it tries to emerge from a dark and dispiriting time. And of course, we are experts at following every twitch and turn in the American psyche. We've been observing it for so long, after all. We are also acutely aware that we are inextricably linked with one another in so many ways, through families, through business, through shared institutional experiences, just like this wonderful university. We are North Americans, after all. The example of the Canadian-American experience holds up for the world that the larger populations in one country can live next door to small populations in another and get along without resort to arms or bullying. Oh yes, there were those early skirmishes, most notably the War of 1812, with one of its principal battles right over here at Queenston Heights. That one gave Canadians a heightened sense of national feeling and solidarity, since the American forces were repulsed there and at Chrysler's Farm to the southwest. The war continued for 3 years, with scattered victories here and there for each side, and finally ended with a treaty that turned back any territory won by either side, putting things pretty much as they were before the fighting started. Teddy Roosevelt wrote a wonderful book on this, and that's his conclusion too. We may as well not have had this because we ended up with where we were. An anniversary of that war is being celebrated this year with not much pomp about it on either side of the border. Since then, Canadian and American forces have fought alongside one another in 2 world wars and in Korea and Afghanistan. Some of us like to remind our American cousins that the American Revolution created not just one country, but 2. The 75,000 United Empire Loyalists who came to Canada had an enormous influence on what we have become as a nation. They were establishment people. Many of them were entrepreneurs, and in holding to the British Crown while rejecting violent overthrow, they set down the roots for what Canadians like to regard as the foundations that have helped to bring us where we are today, based on the principles of peace, order, and good government. Not as sexy, mind you, as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but it seems to have worked fairly well. That same feeling of yearning for order extended into Quebec, where French Canadians, horrified by the excesses of the French Revolution, decided that coexistence with their Canadian partners was the best option. And it wasn't just the United Empire Loyalists who helped mold Canada. The 19th century gold rush attracted American prospectors to British Columbia and the Yukon. When the Canadian prairies were being settled, we saw groups of Mennonites from Pennsylvania stream north to form colonies under the big skies through the provinces of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Yes, it often seems we are just one big family with various offshoots and branches north and south of the 49th parallel. Like all who live in close proximity to one another, we can sometimes be at odds. For Canadians, it's an often justifiable annoyance that Americans don't even know we exist. There is the example of President George W. Bush not even mentioning Canada when he was thanking those countries that helped in 9/11, seeming to forget the thousands of travelers who were harbored in Newfoundland when the skies were closed over North America, and the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who took part in a period of mourning 3 days later through television by a moving service on Parliament Hill in Ottawa. Of course, when it comes to being overlooked, ladies and gentlemen, nothing tops Al Capone's famous line, "I don't even know what street Canada is on." As my late friend and colleague, Peter Jennings, anchor of ABC News, born in Canada, received his early training there, I knew him well, he once pointed out, Canadians have an abiding interest in surprising those Americans who have made little effort to learn much about their neighbors to the north. While oversights and indifference can be hurtful, Canadians are constantly aware of one overarching certainty. If we were to share a border with any other country in the world, there is nobody we'd rather live next to than the United States of America. With a population that outnumbers us 10 to 1 and is still the only true global military superpower, the U.S. stands as a model of fairness and goodwill in dealing with a neighbor. So why do some Canadians worry about the U.S. today? We see your economy recovering, and that's good news for everybody on both sides of the border. But in the last few years, especially since the Great Recession of 2008, Americans are showing a lack of self-confidence and are snapping at each other with constant streams of often vicious invective through the bullhorns of talk shows on radio and television. A few weeks ago, one of your more prominent editorial writers from the conservative stream spoke of a time when members of Congress would actually make concessions to one another. They could be seen happily chatting up each other across the floors of Congress. That's impossible now, she said. U.S. politics have become toxic. There is no will to come together in common cause. And that doesn't just affect the U.S. It can have harshly adverse consequences for the entire world. The United States is still the global leader, the most powerful, democratic, enterprising, and dynamic country of all the larger powers. If it doesn't choose to lead, who will? No one else is ready to step up. China's time is said to be on the horizon, but it has many internal issues, and while its people show great spirit, great enterprise, its government is still autocratic and authoritarian. It often seems much easier for Canada and the United States to come together in common cause in solving trade and border issues than it does for American politicians to agree on something like a budget. They're all caught up in making the other party look bad and are so immersed in the politics of their own side, it's become about beating up the other guy, forgetting why they've been elected in the first place, which is, of course, to serve their constituents. Striking out at your opponent is part of all politics, of course. Let's be honest about that. It's a key component of our adversarial system, and we understand that. But there are times when politicians and leaders of all stripes have to be reminded there is greater purpose after all. Remember this about America. Its leaders had the foresight and energy to lead the reshaping of the world after the catastrophe of World War II. Its example of freedom and democracy for all peoples inspires struggling populations right across the globe. Its artists and business innovators have set exciting standards of achievement in a variety of fields, most notably in recent times, the new technologies. So buck up, America. It's time to get your groove back. And this is where you come in. The Vincentian approach has always stood as a beacon of hope. More than that, in practicing Christianity, you are putting your faith into action. No matter on which side of the border you reside, you can take that philosophy with you out into the world. And you know the core principles of that philosophy: respect for the individual, service to the needy, human solidarity, and adherence to the belief that giving of oneself makes the world a better place. You also know that your higher education is about more than getting a job. It's about learning how to make a difference in the world. And we have seen example after example of just how one person can indeed make a difference. You can set an example in leading your life with moral purpose. You'll be surprised how others will silently take note and be inspired to follow you. Now, if you're sitting there and saying, okay, that's the kind of high tone I'd expect from a commencement speaker, let me give you something more down to earth, really understandable and easily achievable. Before you rush out with too many high expectations, I want to share with you some thoughts from writer Charles Wheeler. He has spent his career teaching economic and public policy and has studied happiness and well-being. In a book just released, he complains that too many commencement speeches hold few of the lessons young people really need to hear today. His book is titled 10 Things Your Commencement Speaker Won't Tell You. He says, these are a few of the things he wishes someone had told his class of '88. I offer you a few I found interesting and easily agree with. Number one, your time in fraternity basements was well spent. The same goes for the time you spent playing intramural sports, working on the school newspaper, or just hanging out with friends. Research tells us that one of the most important causal factors associated with happiness and well-being is your meaningful connections with other human beings. Look around today. Certainly, one benchmark of your graduation success should be how many of these people will still be your close friends in 10 or 20 years from now. Number two, don't make the world worse. You are smart and motivated and creative. Everyone says you can change the world. They are right. But remember that changing the world can also include things like skirting financial regulations and selling unhealthy foods to increasingly obese children. He says, I am not asking you to cure cancer. I am just asking you not to spread it. Number three, it's all borrowed time. You shouldn't take anything for granted, not even tomorrow. And he says, I offer you the hit by a bus rule. Would I regret spending my life this way if I were to get hit by a bus next week or next year? And the important corollary, does this path lead to a life I will be happy with and proud of in 10 or 20 years if I don't get hit by a bus? Don't try to be great. Being great involves luck and other circumstances beyond your control. This is his number 4. The less you think about being great, the more likely it is to happen. And if it doesn't, there is absolutely nothing wrong with being solid. Wheeler is right, of course, about all of that. So try to appreciate every day on your life journey. Go with your passion. Make it worthwhile. Follow your bliss. And have a good trip. Thank you.